I trained 4 team leads, built 2 client pipelines from scratch, and never once missed a deadline. So, naturally, they replaced me with an intern. My name is Eric Molina. I'm 39 years old, and until a few months ago, I was the senior enterprise strategist at a mid-sized tech consultancy in Chicago. I was the guy they called when a 7-figure client got cold feet, or when a product demo went sideways at the last minute. I'd been with the company for nearly 9 years, long enough to remember when our marketing team was a freelancer named Josh who worked from a Starbucks. I wasn't flashy, I didn't post LinkedIn thought pieces or clap back in Slack threads, but I made things work. I cleaned up after overpromisers and turned vague visions into deliverables clients actually paid for. That was the job, and I was good at it. So when my manager Liana pulled me into a call and said, we're bringing in a high-potential intern to support your accounts, I didn't flinch. Everyone needs help. Mentoring was part of the role, but then she added, we're hoping he can shadow you and eventually take some ownership. Ownership! That was the first red flag. I've seen transitions before. They start with a shadow, then a duplicated role in the org chart. Then your responsibilities start streamlining. And before you know it, you're reallocated, if not gone entirely. Still, I gave the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he really was just an intern. Maybe they were trying to groom future talent. It's not like I hadn't mentored before. Then I met him. Brandon T., 22, finance major. Lives in Bali now. Remote-first lifestyle, he said with a grin when we met on Zoom. Brandon's camera was always slightly tilted upward, like he'd positioned it on top of a stack of unread self-help books. He wore AirPods in every meeting and smiled like someone who thought smiling was a substitute for substance. In his second week, he asked if he could co-lead my weekly update with a long-term client. I was stunned. Just to get some reps in, he added, plus I've already mapped the call flow based on their 2022 goals. Their 2022 goals? It was the second quarter of 2024. Still, I let him talk. Maybe he'd surprise me. Spoiler, he didn't. Liana kept dropping in on our syncs with vague praise. Brandon's energy is just what the team needs. Fresh eyes, she'd say. Meanwhile, Brandon kept using words like synergize and move the needle, without ever defining what needle or where we were moving it. In our third week working together, I found out, not from my boss, but from a colleague, that Brandon had been invited to sit in on the quarterly exec briefing. That's the call where strategy leads, people like me, recap progress and propose future initiatives. It's a hard-won seat. And I wasn't on the invite list. I asked Liana directly. Oh, we just thought it'd be great for Brandon to stretch a little, she said. No offense, Eric. You've done this one before. No offense? They had taken my seat and given it to a kid who still had aspiring in his bio. But the real punch came 2 days later. Brandon messaged me. Hey, hope it's cool if I run point on the Jensen deck this week. The Jensen deck, our flagship client, multi-million-dollar renewal pending. He added, figured I could give them a new voice. I stared at the message. A new voice? I'd been managing the Jensen account for 5 years, helped them through 2 infrastructure overhauls, restructured their SLAs, and defended their budget allocation twice when our own CFO tried to cut their support tiers. And now Brandon wanted to run point? I didn't respond right away. I just let the cursor blink. It blinked for almost a minute before I replied. Sure. I'll support silently. You've got it. No sarcasm, no warning. He took the bait. Brandon didn't lack confidence. He was fueled by it. The kind of overconfidence that only comes from never having been publicly wrong in a room that mattered. He talked fast, smiled wide, and never paused long enough to check if he was making sense. On Slack, he was constantly pinging with things like, I think we should realign Jensen's OKRs, or we might want to reframe the narrative around value delivery. But he never followed up with a plan, a metric, or even a concrete sentence. His strategy playbook was a carousel of recycled LinkedIn advice, TED Talk vocabulary, and vague enthusiasm. He started referring to himself as part of the Jensen team in front of other departments, which made people uncomfortable. Some started asking me in DMS, is he full-time now? Others assumed I had trained him to speak this way. The truth was, I hadn't trained him at all. He was barely listening. When I gently reminded him about the nuances of the Jensen contract, how specific wording in their deliverables mattered, how their lead exec hated buzzwords. He nodded, said, "Totally get it," and immediately turned around and wrote cutting-edge solutions in the first slide of the deck. He had ambition, sure, but no understanding of terrain, and worse, no humility. The week of the client call, Brandon doubled down. He wanted to not only lead the presentation, and he wanted to revise the format. "I think it's too old school," he said. "Too heavy on analysis. Clients want a vibe now. Storytelling over numbers, right?" Wrong. Jensen's head of operations used to run a hedge fund. He once paused a presentation I gave because I'd rounded a figure by $30,000. Still, Brandon was on a mission. "I rebuilt the deck from scratch," he said one afternoon. "Want to take a look?" He sent over a 20-slide file titled Jensen Reimagined. It had motion graphics, brand colors, the wrong ones, slightly off from the current palette, and quotes from generic market blogs like, "People don't want products, they want possibilities." He added a new mission statement. Jensen already had one. This one was made up. I gave him one chance. "Did you double-check this with last year's Q3 strategy notes?" Brandon didn't miss a beat. "Didn't need to. Gut check tells me this direction feels right." Gut check. That was the moment I stopped trying to help. I could have told Liana, could have flagged it early, could have saved the call before it happened. But I didn't. Why? Because at some point letting people fail is the only way they learn. The slide deck Brandon had built was based on outdated initiatives, copy-pasted insights, and assumptions Jensen hadn't held in 2 years. But he didn't know that, because he'd never asked. So I made one small change. I swapped the final deck file in the shared folder with a version nearly identical, but with subtle, devastating flaws. The numbers were close, but off just enough to raise eyebrows. "The client success quote," he added. I replaced it with one from a completely different industry partner. And on slide 16, the roadmap timeline, I added a non-existent Q4 launch plan for a product we hadn't built. I named it Jensen Final Confirmed V2, because of course he'd picked the file with the word confirmed in it. And then I waited. The day of the call arrived. Jensen's entire ops team was on the line, their CFO, their head of strategy, their 2 VPS. Brandon logged in early, smiling like he was hosting a startup pitch contest. He opened the deck. He shared his screen, and he began. For the first 6 minutes, no one said a word, just nods, polite listening. Then came slide 7, the revenue segmentation. Jensen's CFO squinted. "That's not accurate. We offboarded segment C last fall." Brandon blinked. "Oh, right. This is pre-consolidation data, just showing historical context." They nodded slowly, suspicion rising. By slide 12, the product integration status. The room was cold. Brandon tried to spin it. "We're projecting a full sync by end of Q4. One of their VPs cut in. "That's news to us." Then silence. Long, sharp, corporate silence. I kept my camera off, muted, just watched. When Brandon first started hinting at taking over the Jensen presentation, I didn't get angry. I got observant. There's a particular kind of arrogance that thrives in tech culture, the kind that confuses confidence with competence. Brandon wasn't the first to think he could fake his way through strategy, but he was the first I'd seen so eager to do it without even asking the right questions. I didn't tell anyone what I was planning. Not my peers, not my manager, not even my contacts on the Jensen team. I needed everything to feel natural. If anyone sensed a setup, the whole point would be lost. The lesson had to come from reality, not from confrontation. The original deck I'd built for Jensen was buried 3 folders deep in our internal archive, fully vetted, packed with tailored data and historical context. I could have handed it to Brandon and let him take credit for a flawless presentation. But something in me said no. Not this time. Instead, I dug up an old version, one that had been built for a different pitch almost 2 years earlier. It was close enough to pass at a glance, but different enough to cause problems for anyone who didn't know the account intimately. And I knew Brandon hadn't done his homework. He never once asked about the client's current KPIs, never once reviewed the latest support logs. He thought he could lead with charisma. I was about to test that theory. The deck I gave him had everything he thought he wanted: slick transitions, graphs with color-coded growth curves, inspirational quotes. It looked polished, which is all Brandon seemed to care about. But there were landmines hidden throughout. The projected revenue figures were taken from a different client in a completely separate industry. The strategy timeline referenced a first-quarter launch for a software suite Jensen had long scrapped, due to budget cuts. And in the closing slide, I inserted a bold statement: with our AI module set to integrate by Q3, automation becomes your competitive edge. That module didn't exist, at least not for Jensen. Brandon reviewed the deck and responded with a thumbs-up emoji and a single word: perfect. I smiled, not because I was proud, because I knew what was coming. I renamed the file to Jensen Final Confirmed VAO 2.PA-PTX and dropped it into the shared folder. He grabbed it within 2 minutes. Didn't even ask if it was the latest version. He never noticed the subtle naming pattern I always used in my deliverables. Never noticed that my final decks were always date-stamped and formatted to match the client's internal taxonomy. Never noticed that I didn't follow up to review the speaking order. He just ran with it, because he thought he'd won. That night, I rehearsed the presentation. Not to practice my lines, but to rehearse what he would say. I knew which parts would trip him up. I knew which buzzwords he'd lean into when the numbers didn't make sense. And I knew exactly when Jensen's CFO would begin to frown. I also did one more thing. I made a backup copy of the original correct deck and quietly sent it to myself, just in case anyone needed to see how things should have gone. By morning, I logged in 5 minutes before the call and stayed off camera. Brandon greeted everyone like a talk show host. So excited to walk you through where we're going. You're gonna love it. I muted myself. Just listened. The first few slides were safe enough. Generic welcome slides and a quick recap of our mission. But then he hit slide 6. The client's VP of sales leaned forward. I'm sorry, did you just say your Q1 forecast includes our legacy integration suite? Brandon stammered. Yes, based on our latest alignment. The VP blinked. That project was shut down last October. We pivoted away from legacy systems. Brandon paused. Right, but that's exactly why this is such a powerful move, reopening that window with modern architecture. I almost choked. Reopening a scrapped platform was not bold. It was reckless. By the time he reached slide 10, the tension was thick. The CFO had gone silent, taking notes. One of the junior managers looked visibly uncomfortable. Then Brandon hit the fake AI integration slide. And here's where we leap forward: automated module deployment by Q3. He paused dramatically. This is where your margins get optimized. No one said a word, until the CFO raised a single eyebrow and asked, What module are you referring to? Brandon clicked nervously. The AI automation workflow. It's in development. The CFO replied, We canceled that R&D effort. Nothing's been in development since Q1 last year. We never received a scope update. That was it. The screen froze. Brandon tried to pivot. We're talking early-stage ideation. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. But it was too late. I watched quietly as the deck collapsed around him. Each bullet point raised a new doubt. Each slide reminded the client that someone had stopped paying attention. And the worst part? Brandon didn't even realize how much damage he was doing. I didn't need to intervene. The slides did it for me. The silence after the final slide wasn't the kind that invited applause. It was the kind that made your throat tighten. On screen, the Jensen team looked frozen. Not in awe, but in disbelief. Their CFO leaned back in his chair, pen twirling in his fingers like he was deciding whether to say something or simply end the call and never speak to us again. Brandon didn't seem to notice, or maybe he did and was trying to push through it. He smiled, that same confident, oblivious smile, and said, Any questions? The VP of Strategy unmuted her mic first. Yes, she said. Where did you source the Q2 performance metrics? Because we haven't shared those projections with any vendors. Brandon blinked. Oh, those numbers? They're based on historical trend lines. Predictive modeling. Based on what model? She asked. Brandon hesitated, then said, An in-house forecast, derived from last year's client data, and internal tools, to get ahead of the curve. That did it. Jensen's head of ops leaned forward, visibly irritated. You used our old data to make new assumptions about products we no longer support. That's not forecasting, that's fabrication. Brandon's smile finally cracked. I didn't say a word. Someone from our finance team messaged me directly. Are you seeing this? I typed back, every second. Brandon tried one last pivot, the desperate kind. Listen, I totally understand the confusion, but this was meant to start a conversation, not lock in hard data. He said start a conversation like it was an escape hatch. But the Jensen team had already stopped listening. They were reading between the slides now, seeing how many corners had been cut, realizing that someone they trusted, hadn't been watching their business closely. That trust didn't just vanish, it flipped. The CFO unmuted again. We'll need to pause future discussions until we review this internally. Thank you for your time. The call ended, abrupt, quiet, final. Brandon sat on the screen for a few seconds after everyone had left, looking stunned. After the call, Slack was a minefield. No one said anything directly, but you could feel the shift. The usual emojis and praise threads were gone. Even Liana, who had championed Brandon's rise, stayed silent. Brandon finally messaged me. Hey man, not sure what happened. Thought the deck was solid. I responded without punctuation. It was the wrong deck. There was a pause, then a reply. Wait, what do you mean wrong? I typed. Deleted. Retyped. You used a template version from an old pitch. You never verified the content. Brandon tried to recover. Dude, why didn't you say anything? I didn't answer, because that was the real problem. He never asked. That night I got a message from one of the senior account managers. The Jensen team called us directly. They want someone else on the account. Another message followed 10 minutes later. They said they want whoever used to run it, not the intern. I stared at the screen. The irony was perfect. They'd wanted someone fresh, someone who could bring a new energy. What they learned, the hard way, was that relationships aren't built with deck polish or buzzwords. They're built with context, memory, and presence. None of which Brandon had. And when you fumble a $1 million client call, you don't just lose face, you lose trust. The Monday after the call, Jensen's name disappeared from the shared sales dashboard. No announcement, no memo, just gone. Quietly removed from active status, tucked away like a failed pilot program no one wanted to admit ever happened. I waited for someone to bring it up in the team stand-up. No one did, not even Liana. She looked tired, not embarrassed, just cornered. She spoke in circles that day. We're refocusing our enterprise priorities and looking for new alignment on long-term opportunities. Translation, we blew it. Brandon didn't show up to the meeting. His calendar was marked internal sync, a vague term but telling. That same afternoon, I got an invite to a leadership recovery session. The title alone made me want to laugh, but I accepted it. When the video call started, Liana was there with 2 people from Ops and a senior manager from the client relations team. Eric, she said, we need your help on the Jensen account. I didn't smile, just nodded. What exactly are you asking? I said. We're hoping you can re-engage, reframe the relationship, she said. It's delicate, but you know the account better than anyone. There was no apology, just opportunity, and that told me everything I needed to know. I rejoined the Jensen project, temporarily, they said, just to stabilize the damage. I was careful, professional. I didn't badmouth Brandon. I didn't make jabs in meetings. I just did the job. Within a week, Jensen was replying to my emails again. Short, cautious responses, but responses nonetheless. By the second week, we had a follow-up call. They kept their cameras off. I didn't blame them. I started the meeting with one sentence. I know what happened last time wasn't acceptable. There was silence, then a simple reply. We appreciate you being back on the call. That was all I needed. I walked them through a new plan, grounded, accurate, forward-looking, no over-promising, no jargon, just solutions. They asked questions, real ones. I had answers, honest ones. By the end of the call, they agreed to extend the contract by 90 days. That was the first step. Back at the office, Brandon was moved to another account, something smaller, internal, low risk. I didn't ask where. I didn't care. One morning, I passed him in the hallway. Virtual hallway, that is. He sent a Slack wave emoji. I didn't respond. Not out of pettiness, just clarity. We weren't peers. The team stopped referring to him as the new guy and started saying things like, "Oh, Brandon's handling that part now." Neutral. Passive. The fire around him had gone out. As for me, Liana pulled me aside during one of our check-ins. "Eric, just so you know, the leadership team really values your ability to handle high-pressure situations." I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I replied, "I just try not to make a mess that someone else has to clean up." She didn't say anything after that. I started getting messages from colleagues again, people I hadn't heard from in months. "Glad you're back on Jensen. You saved us. We knew something was off." I didn't respond to most of them, not out of pride, just peace. I wasn't looking for applause. I had what I needed. The system had corrected itself, quietly, no drama, no scandal. Just the slow but certain realization that some roles aren't replaceable by energy and buzzwords alone, and sometimes, when you give someone exactly what they ask for, you also give them exactly what they deserve. I never said a word to Jensen about Brandon's role in the mix-up. I didn't need to. The silence in that first call said enough, and the fact that they asked for me, specifically, told me they already knew where the trust lived. That kind of clarity doesn't need an explanation. It needs follow-through, and I gave them that. The irony was never lost on me. They brought in someone new to refresh the voice, to shake things up, and in doing so almost shook the entire deal apart. What they didn't realize was that every polished deck, every clean dashboard, every quarterly target hit wasn't just structure, it was storytelling, the kind that only works when you've actually lived the chapters. What Brandon never understood was that no matter how many buzzwords you rehearse, no client buys enthusiasm. They buy certainty. And that kind of confidence only comes from knowing, from being in the trenches long enough to tell the difference between noise and signal. I didn't set him up to fail. He did that on his own. I just made sure the deck reflected his level of effort. And in the end, the deck did what it was always meant to do. Communicate clearly. A few weeks later, I got a message from a former client who had switched companies. "Hey Eric, heard you're free. Want to build something from scratch again?" I didn't respond right away. I let the message sit for a day. Then I replied, "Let's talk next week." I wasn't desperate. I wasn't burned out. I was finally in control again. Meanwhile, back at the company, things started shifting. Leadership was quieter. The intern pipeline became less aggressive. I noticed fewer early career hires being handed high-profile accounts. The pendulum had started to swing back. I wasn't celebrating, just watching. Eventually, I stepped away. Not with a bang, no dramatic goodbye post or all-hands announcement. Just a clean resignation, 2 lines, 1 sentence. "Thank you for the opportunity. My last day will be Friday." No questions asked, just quiet respect. On my last call with Jensen, the same CFO who had called out Brandon said, "Appreciate how you handled things, Eric. You brought the room back down to earth." That stuck with me. Not you saved us, not you fixed it. Just you brought the room back down to earth. That's the thing people forget in this business. It's not always about being flashy. It's about being reliable, making sure the floor doesn't drop beneath the conversation, and that's what I had always been good at. I didn't leave bitter, just finished. The mistake they made wasn't hiring someone younger. It was assuming institutional memory had no value. That legacy was a liability, that anyone could wear your face and say your lines and get the same results. But they were wrong. Because when the spotlight hit the wrong deck, the right reputation came back into focus. As I shut down my laptop for the last time, I archived a folder I'd kept for years. Client notes Jensen. Inside were 24 files, personal context, meeting logs, notes about family members, pain points, wins, losses. Brandon would have called that overkill. I called it work, and that's why I'll always land on my feet. Because while the intern was building his personal brand, I was building relationships. And unlike flashy decks or fabricated confidence, real trust doesn't get replaced. It just waits to be remembered.